Hey class, tonight we're going to talk about Japan and essentially its ascendancy from Asia. Japan's about the only exception to the general rule that um, non-European states became colonized or became subject to um, a European state. If you'll recall, last time we talked about Japan, uh, Japan was feudal. It had a shogun. It had a daimyo, the powerful noble clans that ran the country. The emperor was a figurehead, uh, recognized as the supreme leader, but didn't have any real power. The shogun was a military dictator appointed by the emperor, generally came from one or two families. As it turned out, over the centuries, it kind of ping-ponged back and forth between two major families. Uh, the samurai, of course, just about everybody's heard of samurai. These were a military nobility, basically a warrior caste, sworn to individual daimyo families, kind of like the way knights were sworn to serve a lord in feudal Europe. Uh, Probably the most significant shogunate was the Tokugawa shogunate. This is like a dynasty, essentially. The Tokugawa family controlled the shogunate for 250 or more years, from 1603 to 1868. And the Tokugawa placed samurai above the commoners. So in terms of really making the samurai a caste, the Tokugawa shogunate really placed them socially above commoners. They also essentially inserfed the peasants, the Japanese peasants, and they also had a pretty significant isolationist streak. Japan, of course, is a series of islands, several thousand islands actually, that were relatively uninhabited except for the main islands. And they were very strict about isolating Japan from foreign contact, with the exception of the Dutch. Once a year, the Dutch were allowed to come in to the main port, trade, and then leave. And they weren't allowed back. Now, this all changes with the Black Fleet of 1853. The Americans actually kicked down the door of Japan's isolation. Commodore Matthew Perry of the United States Navy and four modern warships, ironclads essentially, steamed into the main port of Japan and demanded that Japan open trade with the United States and forced them to sign a trade and peace treaty. Essentially, the issue was that in the event that a American ship sank or had some sort of trouble, mechanical trouble or whatever, there was an incident basically where there was a shipwreck right off the Japanese coast, and when the American sailors came ashore, the story goes that they were slaughtered by the Japanese, and they weren't getting the assistance they needed. The Americans weren't getting the assistance they wanted, and so they sent a flotilla over to open up the Japanese nation. Now, this is an example of what we call gunboat diplomacy. So you're basically using force to get a diplomatic result. Okay, that's an important term that we'll see often in history, especially United States history, frankly. Let's see here. The Japanese were kind of shocked by how far ahead everybody else was, by the Europeans, the Americans especially, and they forced the shogunate out of power. The emperor forced, and there's there's a lot of fighting, there's combat back and forth, and the forces of modernity forced the much more conservative military caste of the shogun and the samurai out of power. And this represented this period called the Meiji Restoration. It took about 15 years, but the Meiji Restoration, started in 1868, was the restoration of the emperor into power. And it represented a period of very intense nationalist fervor. The Japanese had been paying lip service to the emperor. He was recognized as a god on Earth. And the emperor basically had carte blanche to make changes in society and did so. Restructured the socioeconomic status of just about everybody. And the Japanese realized that if they didn't industrialize, the West was going to take them over. Okay. Now, to their credit, the Japanese sent out diplomats and scholars and researchers all around the world to the major powers, the industrialized powers, to find out what the story was. And their analysis was, wow, if we don't industrialize, we're going to end up the way of India or so many other countries, the African countries, China. Now, it is an amazing act that within one generation, Japan became an industrial power. They revamped their entire economy. They built it from the ground up. And they also became imperialist. In a very real sense, they followed the path of the European nations and began engaging in wars with their neighbors. The Chinese-Japanese War, the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95, they defeated the Chinese, took over Korea as a stepping stone into Manchuria, which was a province, if you'll recall, Manchuria. Manchuria was that northernmost province just north of Korea, which had a lot of natural resources that the Japanese wanted to feed their industrial machine. Now, probably most shocking of all was the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905, where the Japanese defeated two, not one, but two Russian fleets in battle, and their troops defeated Russian armies sent to defeat them, and the Japanese proved that non-European powers, when they were industrialized, could defeat European powers. Now, with a caveat, let's not kid ourselves, the Russians were backwards. They were also 3,000 plus miles away from their base in Moscow and, west of the Ural Mountains. They're fighting in the East Asian coast. With that said, nevertheless, the Japanese showed that it could be done, and that it wasn't a question of like some sort of social Darwinist weakness amongst Asian or African. It was a question of having the tools and the will to apply them. Of course, we talked about the fact that they also helped stop the Boxer Rebellion. Now, probably the most interesting historical piece is that the Japanese were an ally with Great Britain after 1902 and joined World War I on the side of the British and the French and later the Americans. They attacked and seized German bases, coaling stations, really, in the Pacific, and also seized German interests in China as well. As this map indicates, you can see the spread of Japanese influence in Asia. And by the end of World War I, the Japanese were the most powerful nation in the Asian Pacific region. And they set out to set up what they referred to as their co-prosperity sphere, this red line, as you can see, which basically was their goal of coming to secure enough raw materials and a sufficient buffer, strategic military buffer around the Japanese islands to defend them adequately through naval force. We'll talk more tomorrow. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.